Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first joint event between the Oxford Martin School and the International Relations Society. I have the pleasure of introducing to you Kate Allen, who will tonight be talking to us on Amnesty International and the challenges for human rights. She started her exciting career at a local government level as a policy officer before becoming part of the Refugee Council, where she headed the UK's evacuation programme for Kosovo and Bosnia. After this, she joined Amnesty International, and she has led the UK division since 2000. I'm sure we'll have a very exciting talk, and please help me in welcoming her here tonight.
Thank you, and it's really nice to be here, and for so many of you to be here. Thank you very much. I thought I'd talk a bit about where we are at Amnesty at the moment and some of the things that we're thinking about. I was saying to Mary, I've just come from we have 2-3 day meetings of my colleagues having flown in from all around the world globally to talk about the future and the direction and the work that we're doing at the moment. And it's an exciting time in Amnesty, and obviously there are some massive challenges that we're dealing with. And I thought I would set out just a bit of a flavour of the sorts of things we're involved in at the moment, and then some of the things that we're talking about while we think about our next strategic goals as a movement. We're a democracy as Amnesty. We have 7 million members and supporters globally. We're thinking from 2016 to 2020, what should we put our effort, our campaigning, our activism, our research, where should we put our effort in that time frame? And as a global movement, we'll be making those decisions round about August next year. So lots of thinking going on, lots of talking, lots of looking at where we go for the future. But right in the middle of it at the moment too. So there is never a quiet time in Amnesty, but I must say that at the moment we are dealing with more crises than I can ever remember Amnesty dealing with in the world. So just to mention a few of them, and they won't surprise you. Iraq, we have had a continuous presence as Amnesty in Iraq over several months. We've written and produced 2 reports about ethnic cleansing from ISIS. We have met with and talked to witnesses and survivors of ethnic cleansing that has taken place. We are talking too about some of the outrages that the Iraqi government has been involved in, the lack of anybody being held to account for that behaviour. In Syria, we now know that the World Food Programme is saying that there are 6.3 million people inside Syria who are in need of emergency food. We have the biggest refugee crisis in living memory in terms of what is happening in that part of the world. 60% of the 23 million Syrians are now living in poverty, and we have millions of refugees who have moved out of Syria to neighbouring countries. We have researchers on the Syrian-Turkish border. We've seen the ISIS abuses that are taking place there. We have seen the conditions that refugees are living in and have taken testimony from many. And we hope, before too long, that that testimony that we have will be used to bring people to account. I was in the Lebanon just recently, where a small country of 4 million people is providing home to 1.4 million Syrian refugees. And Lebanon is about half the size of Wales. You have a tiny country, massive pressure. As I arrived, ISIS moved into the north of Lebanon and they beheaded 2 Lebanese soldiers. We don't hear about these things, and not nearly enough in this country. I met refugees in informal camps and settlements, in Shatila refugee camp, in many different places, living in real poverty scraping together the means to keep themselves and their children alive. Absolutely rudimentary, and in many places no health care at all. And do you know what the UK's contribution to that refugee crisis has been so far? We at Amnesty fought really hard to get the UK government to join a Syrian refugee programme, which they did. We won that battle. But now what we see is a UK government that so far has taken 80 refugees. So 1.4 million in Lebanon, 80 in the UK. And when I met with Lebanese politicians who were talking about closing their borders to stop people coming in, and of course, as Amnesty, we wouldn't want that to happen, but very directly being told by those politicians, don't tell us to keep our borders open while you close yours. So there really is a challenge to us here in the UK. We are also, as Amnesty, still picking up some of the work and pieces from from Israel and Gaza over the summer, where we saw 2,000 people in Gaza die, 57 in Israel, mostly military, mostly soldiers. Again, we want to see a proper investigation into what happened there. Again, I was in Israel. The Israeli authorities refused to allow us into Gaza. The first time ever that we've been refused access to Gaza, still being refused that access. But again, in the UK, a government that wouldn't even look at stopping arms sales to Israel when we could show that those arms and components that were going to Israel were being used in situations where UN schools and other civilian areas were being bombed. We've taken up, just in the last few weeks, issues around freedom of expression in really diverse parts of the world. Hong Kong, obviously, people's ability to take to the streets to argue for democracy, in their case. In the US, our US section has been in Ferguson, in Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown. We've issued a report on military-grade weapons being used by the police, and we are at the centre of a debate in that country about race and policing. Meanwhile, so these are some of the things that just come and make, as Amnesty, just have to make sure that we respond to those. We have longer-term campaigns too. We have a campaign which has taken Amnesty into some new territory. It's a campaign that we call My Body, My Rights, and it covers a range of sexual and reproductive rights issues. And we issued a report in just a couple of weeks ago on abortion in El Salvador. There is a total ban on abortion in El Salvador. Simply in no circumstances at all is a woman allowed to have an abortion. No circumstances at all. So if a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, there will be no surgical intervention until she is hemorrhaging, until it is absolutely clear that that fetus, that is never going to survive anyway, has no life left to it. And at that stage, there'll be medical intervention. So women's lives go right to the line before there is intervention. We have women in prison, 17 women in prison in El Salvador on pregnancy-related charges. Can you believe such a thing? Women who are being imprisoned for seeking abortions, for having illegal abortions, and 11% of those abortions end in the fatality of the woman. So a country that just takes such an approach that the health of the woman simply does not count at all. And an abortion and medical personnel are just not able to act, and we are seeing women die. And we had a really good reception publicly to our work there, so we have a great campaign. We're moving on this issue in other parts of the world too, and do ask me questions about that if you would like. We've been doing some work on Afghanistan over many years, and you will see today that British troops have left. And after many years of intervention, there have been huge gains for women in Afghanistan, massive gains, including the fact that girls are now in education and in schools, and able to take their place, some of them, in the workforce. But those gains are so tentative. And at Amnesty, we've been working really closely with lots of women human rights defenders and their organisations to try to support them and to make sure that they have the support from the international community through human rights defender programmes that embassies in Kabul can use to put the protection of their governments over women activists who get threatened. And that happens a lot. It is a dangerous thing to be a woman activist, human rights activist in Afghanistan. And I've met with many women, both in Kabul and with our partners who come to the UK for work that we do together, on how we can support and work alongside them to make sure that they're able to continue doing their work. But there is huge fear from those women about the ways in which the Taliban and other repressive measures could force back the progress. When I was in Kabul a couple of years ago, even then, there were many women from the provinces saying that people were starting to take their girls out of school because they didn't want to be the family that was had their girls in school, given that they had this fear that the Taliban might be back. So it's a fear. Women have fought long and hard. International forces are leaving, but we can't desert those women. We really must show that solidarity, and we must make governments around the world show that solidarity and give as much protection as they can. We've also continued as Amnesty to work on a long-term programme, work that Amnesty have done over many, many years on refugees and migrants, and we've been looking at what's happening in the central Mediterranean. So far this year, since the start of this year, over 2,500 people have drowned or are missing on their way from North Africa across the Mediterranean. And there is, apart from Italy, apart from the Italian government, who are involved in search and rescue operations, there is no EU response to that. There is no EU response to that. 2,500 people. And that isn't acceptable. And then as we were meeting in London with people having flown from different parts of the world, including colleagues from West Africa, from Senegal, we were talking about Ebola and its impact on our section of Amnesty in Sierra Leone, where we have staff and members, and real fear about what will happen to them and their families, and the ways in which they are continuing to work, but the ways in which life has become so difficult for them. And we were hearing from our colleagues in Senegal about discrimination and stigmatism of people from Guinea at the moment in different parts of West Africa. So work there that we at Amnesty will need to be involved in. And that's just putting that down on a piece of paper on the train from London, thinking about the things that we've been talking about today. That's the kind of immediate agenda, and I'll have missed loads of things off that, but the immediate things that as heads of sections of Amnesty globally we have been talking about. But we've also been talking about how do we prepare ourselves and what should we look like and how should we take up our role in terms of strategic goals moving forward. And when I look back to when I first started at Amnesty and the human rights challenges that faced us then and those today, it's very different. In 2000, some people were arguing that the end of history was upon us, that the West had prevailed and we lived in a unipolar world. Today, we see that that simply isn't the case and that we live in a world where power is much more dispersed. And although the US remains the most powerful state, including in economic and military terms, there are growing economies in the East and the South which are catching up. And by 2050, it's predicted that China and India alone will account for 41% of the global economy. And China will have surpassed the US in defense spending. We're also thinking about those other emerging economic powers, such as Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, South Korea, and Turkey, able to exert much more influence on the international agenda. And we witness our global governance being reshaped to recognize that. So we've seen the rise of the G20 at the expense of the G8 during the economic and global financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And as Amnesty, what we have been doing is making sure that we are present in those countries. So we have built our presence in Brazil, in Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, hugely vibrant sections of Amnesty International, doing some brilliant work, making sure that we are able to have the same conversations with governments in those parts of the world as we are here in the UK and in many parts of Europe, making sure that we at Amnesty are truly a global movement. We're also seeing some of the shaping of the international human rights system. This is a system that we at Amnesty have been part of over our 53 years of building. It is where human rights norms are established, interpreted, and enforced at UN level. And we contribute to defending and strengthening it. And as Amnesty, we were a central part of ensuring that the International Arms Trade Treaty became the latest treaty to join the lexicon of treaties that we spend our campaigning lives fighting for. So we now have an International Arms Trade Treaty which will come into force on Christmas Eve globally, and it will regulate the flow, the way in which arms are traded around the world. So a new addition to the treaties that we fight for and to see implemented. The human rights machinery of the UN has already been reformed. The voting rights of Western states were reduced with the establishment of the Human Rights Council in 2006. And we can now sometimes see council resolutions against serious violators. Obviously, we don't often see those resolutions about the most powerful. And we can sometimes see cross-regional support being developed. And so there is a little more credibility, but it is still the case that the most powerful in the world are seldom brought to account. But emerging powers have become really active in the mechanisms of the Council. They are a very vibrant part of that. But stronger international methods of enforcing human rights are also contentious. And many of these emerging powers have memories of colonial and other foreign interventions. And there's a belief that NATO exceeded the Security Council's authorization of the use of force in Libya, and its hardened views, particularly amongst the BRIC countries, about the practical application of responsibility to protect, where states fail to stop atrocities within their own borders. So attitudes to that and to the international criminal justice system are very mixed. We're worried at Amnesty that the international community is probably moving backwards from a high watermark in the area of international criminal justice following the end of the Cold War, driven partly by deadlocks in the UN Security Council and concerns about the high cost of ad hoc international criminal tribunals. We've seen the International Criminal Court taking up cases. We have seen how in many parts of the world this is viewed and is becoming viewed as a north-on-south phenomenon. When I was in Sierra Leone a year ago, I did an interview with a kind of a hard talk style interview where the interviewer, the journalist interviewing me, was absolutely furious with his anger that those states that are seen to be allies of the US and others are never held to account. That's blocked at UN Security Council level. And those are things that we must be conscious of as Amnesty, and we must work on, because the International Criminal Court is the hope that with that court we can see people being brought to account, and we can see those that abuse power knowing that they will be brought to account, they won't get away with it, the world will pull them in front of a court and they will be prosecuted. So it is hugely important that we defend, support, improve the working of that court in all ways that we can. So we have our work cut out as Amnesty on those fronts. Do we continue to prioritise those areas of work? We've also seen emerging powers become also obviously emerging economies, and in the UK seen very much as vital trading partners, and we sometimes think that our own government puts the need or the imperative for trade well ahead of any issues about human rights. And it was telling, I think, that when the Prime Minister went to China earlier this year, he was accompanied by 130 business people, but not by even one human rights advisor. And these are the things that we raise with the Foreign Office and with the Prime Minister, because if you are going to be serious about these issues, you can't say that you're not going to raise them in whole swathes of the world. China, Saudi Arabia, many others, where the UK government, we think, completely pulls its punches in terms of taking up issues of human rights. We're looking at Amnesty, we've done work on the power of corporates in the world, both for good and for bad, their influence in terms of human rights. We're thinking about whether that is an area for us, for it to become more of a focus for the future. I'd be interested in what you think about that. We've been looking at discrimination, the continuing ways in which discrimination work in the world. The question of women's human rights, obviously, but not only women's human rights. There has been progress. There's been massive progress, but there is still structural gender inequality, and women continue to enjoy less economic and political power than men. It's predicted that the fastest progress in closing the gender gap over the next 20 years will be in East Asia and Latin America, and the slowest will be in the Middle East, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. As Amnesty, we have been raising issues about the use of sexual violence in conflict. We're delighted to see our former Foreign Secretary, William Hague, take that as something that he turned into UK foreign policy in a Foreign Office that was thinking, why is the Foreign Secretary going on about sexual violence in conflict? That's not foreign policy. And he quite clearly has made his stamp clear on this. Yes, it is, and the UK will put its political capital into tackling this issue. I hope his successors continue with that. He's made a great start, but it is, as he knows too, only a start. And the ways in which sexual violence goes without people being held to account, without the right support for women in the aftermath of conflict, without women being involved in the peace processes and the negotiations that take place after conflict. It goes all the way through those issues. And that, again, is something that we're looking at for our future. Where do we prioritise gender and work on women's human rights? LGBT issues are in our thoughts on this one too. We've seen in many parts of Africa and the Middle East and in Russia, we've seen people from the LGBT communities being discriminated against. In Uganda, the threat of execution at one stage simply for being gay. In Moscow at the beginning of this year, I met with gay rights organisations who told me that when they encounter gay citizens, when they encounter violence on the streets, the police stand back and watch it. They don't intervene, they don't stop it, and that violence is rife and growing worse. Here in the UK, as well as in many other parts of the West, we're seeing a bit of a populist backlash against human rights, about the concept of it. Some of those drivers are the economic downturn, terrorist threats, anti-immigration, anti-human rights messaging from populist politicians. We've seen in our own country the attacks upon the Human Rights Act and threats to pull out of the European Court of Human Rights. Just astonishing things. You know, a convention that covers 47 countries of Europe, it's got nothing to do with the EU, being used as a political football in an anti-European debate. And the message and the damage that can do when you think about, we're in that convention with Russia, with other countries that will simply love to see the UK ignore rulings of the court so that they can then just do the same. We will be not just doing a disservice to people here in the UK, we will be setting a pattern of ignoring conventions, which is deeply shocking to be contending with. So we have a lot that we're thinking about in terms of how we will work as Amnesty. But at the core of all that we do is the fact that we are an activist organisation. We are a movement of ordinary people who stand up for justice, and our numbers globally in terms of members and supporters is now at 7 million and growing. And we want to make sure that we continue to do that because we believe in the power of ordinary people to effect change. We believe that when we work together, when we put our effort together as ordinary people, we can make that change. And sometimes it can just all feel, as an individual level, too hard, too difficult. You turn the television on, you open your newspaper, you look online and you see all these appalling things happening in the world, and it's just, where do you start? Well, you start by joining Amnesty, because what we can do is bring people together, and we can and we do have that effect. So in El Salvador, there was a woman called Miriam who was being denied life-threatening treatment in her pregnancy. We won that case. She lives. She would have died. On the Arms Trade Treaty, a 20-year campaign, 20 years from a couple of Amnesty staff saying, wouldn't it be a good idea if globally we could control arms flows, not just country by country, so that everybody says, well, until everybody's doing it, nobody will. 20 years later, we have that treaty. Our task now is to make that work effectively. So we do have major successes, and we achieve it because of the power of ordinary people. So it's in our DNA, it's in our bloodstream, it's in everything that we do, that we are an activist organisation. We believe totally in the power of that. We are exercising all sorts of new ways of doing that, including social media, but also people like to meet other people and engage in this work together. And so our movement is building. We are in more parts of the world than we have ever been before. We have plans for growing our membership for the future. And I will stop there because I've just seen the clock and it's half an hour since I started talking. So I will stop, and it would be great to be able to try to answer any of your questions and any of your thoughts about where you would think in the next 5 years you would like to see, or you think there are some challenges that Amnesty should be addressing. So thank you very much.
could I just ask that if you have a question, please could you wait for the microphone to come? This lecture is being filmed, so we need the microphone so that people watching online can hear your questions. But also just to say that by asking a question, you are agreeing to be filmed. So if you don't want to be filmed, you know, your voice on film, don't ask a question.
You could ask me afterwards.
So I have the microphone for the first person who wants to ask a question. Oh, you've got it.
Hi, sorry, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. Yeah, and I wondered how closely you work with anthropologists on sort of culturally sensitive campaigns and that sort of thing, and yeah, the kind of relationship there.
I'm not sure that we have worked with anthropologists. Isn't that interesting? Mostly in terms of cultural sensitivity, our approach as Amnesty is to be present in as many countries of the world as we can. So we have Amnesty sections in about 70 countries of the world, and we are moving our research staff from London to be in dispersed parts of the world in terms of hubs. So we will be in most parts of the world as Amnesty International. And if we're not present there, if there are places in the world that it is difficult for us to operate in, we seldom do we seldom go into countries unannounced. We usually turn up on the door, knock, say we're from Amnesty, and either get let in or refused access. We don't go undercover. The only times in my memory we've ever done that is very recently in Syria, actually. So we, in parts of the world where we can't be present, we always have contacts. We have organisations, people, lawyers, doctors, and I'm not sure about anthropologists. I shall ask about that one. Maybe we're missing something there. But thank you.
How do you go about judging on a given human rights campaign whether that campaign's been successful or not, or which campaigns have been more successful? How do you go about quantitatively understanding that?
It's a very good question, and it's not easy. And some of our campaigns take a long time. So the Arms Trade Treaty, 20 years. This was the abolition of the death penalty. We started that one in 1971. But you can measure that, because you can measure the countries that become abolitionist. And the key to it all, I think, is to be really clear when you're setting out your campaign, what is it that you're trying to do? And to make that as clear and as specific as possible. So we have, at Amnesty, we have all sorts of ways that we talk about building campaigns. We have a model that we use in terms of how we're trying to change things in the world. We're very specific about what it is, and stages on the way, milestones along the way, and then we'll report and evaluate ourselves against that. But some of it, sometimes we do things and we know we're not going to succeed. But we do them anyway, and sometimes the act of solidarity in itself is important. So you know that there's something happening. You don't think that you're actually going to, as Amnesty, be able to influence that, but you want the people who are involved in that to know they're not alone. And so I value that enormously too, and I've had that fed back to me by people in different parts of the world, that solidarity in really difficult situations which weren't going to change meant an enormous amount. So we can't measure everything, but we try to be really clear as we set out on something, what is it we're trying to change. We have a Stop Torture campaign at the moment. It's addressing 5 countries. They're not the 5 worst countries in the world, but they're 5 countries where we think that if we can shift some of the practices in each of those countries, we'll have made an impact there, but we can work from that regionally for greater impact on the issue of torture. And there are very specific things like independent medical evidence, having lawyers present when interrogations are taking place, bringing torturers to account where you know that that has happened, charging them. So in each of the 5 countries, there's very, very specific targets. We have a 2-year time frame, and we'll measure it at the end and say, we managed to do that, we didn't do this, and look at what worked, what didn't work, and learn from it for the next campaigning.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I've been following a lot on the performance of Amnesty International and on sexual violence in war conflicts. And I have a very specific question. What have you been involved, or have you done anything as an organization in Eastern Ukraine? Because I'm not sure that you know, and that maybe people in the West know about that, but in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, there are 400,000 internally displaced people. And there are a lot of young women and young girls who were put in slavery, in sexual slavery, and they've been raped. And this issue hasn't been raised. I have never seen any report in any Western press about that. So I would like to know has any work been done there, and are you planning anything, particularly given the UK interest in preventing sexual violence?
Okay, so we have a section of Amnesty in Ukraine. It's a very long-standing section, been around for a good while. It's done quite a bit of work during the current difficulties there. Our Secretary General visited within the last month, had various high-level government meetings, and we've been doing some reports on the situation in eastern Ukraine too. I'm not sure that we have covered the issue of rape. I'm trying to remember where that work is at the moment. We've certainly been dealing with issues of torture, disappearances, killings, and we have a report that came out just recently. So we have done quite a bit of work, but I'll take that back on the issue of rapes, and perhaps we could have a quick word afterwards, and you could tell me more about what you're hearing.
Thank you very much for your time. Curious as to whether Amnesty is doing or is planning to do anything in the situation in Mexico at the moment, where there's massive protests on account of a number of disappearances and lack of investigation by the police on it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, again, we have a section of Amnesty in Mexico, very vibrant one, growing. It's quite small, but it is growing, and we're about to move quite a bit of our research on the Americas to Mexico City, so that we're based in Mexico City covering the Americas. We're looking to do something in South America. We have sections there, but to put our research possibly somewhere in South America. In Mexico, we have done quite a bit of work. We've done quite a lot of work around the disappearances and murders of young women in Juarez. So I think people know over many years there have been disappearances, rape and murder of young women, and absolutely no proper investigations by Mexican police and authorities, and we've been working with the mothers of those. I'm not sure what we're doing at the moment on the disappearance of the students. We've certainly been looking and raising that issue in terms of press work within Mexico. So I know that my colleagues there have been doing that. Who's got the microphone?
Sorry. Where would you like me to go next?
Down the front, there's a whole row of hands here. Oh.
So you mentioned briefly in the coming agenda for Amnesty the consideration of engaging more with corporate partners potentially. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, explain what the vision is on that front.
Okay. Shall I take a couple of questions? Do you want to ask you?
My question was linking the sanitation issue and sexual violence in India. Like in India, 60% of the population does not have access to a toilet, so that puts women at risk of sexual violence. Recently, there were cases of girls going missing and being raped when they went out in the open. So is it figuring somewhere in the agenda of Amnesty in the near future?
Okay. Should we take the third one as well here, which is just here, and then I can deal with three?
Thank you. My question is, what's the Amnesty stance, or what type of action does Amnesty take on issues such as female genital mutilation?
Okay. So, working backwards, FGM, we have done quite a bit of work in different parts of the world around FGM. And I think the most impressive that I have seen in my time at Amnesty has been in Sierra Leone. We have a section, as I said, in Sierra Leone. When I was there last year, I travelled with them through the country, and we went to villages which where Amnesty had been working with villagers, and villagers declared themselves to be Amnesty villages. It was just amazing. And they had worked on a kind of human rights programme as villagers with Amnesty, talking about what, if you introduced human rights, if you had discussions about human rights and what they meant, what would that mean about the way that you would live your lives and be with each other. And they were astonishing places to go. And there was one village where the women in the village had stopped sending their girls to a particular society. Had a name, the society, and I've forgotten the name, had a society name, and they would send their girls there for cutting. And women were stopping doing that. They were also taking this kind of real, their activism was just brilliant. So if in their village they heard of a woman being beaten by her husband, they turned up as a whole load of women outside the house and sat down, invited the man out, had a conversation about how this really had to stop, that it wasn't a good way for him to be with his wife, and his children shouldn't see things like that, and they would have that conversation, and if they weren't getting anywhere, they would call the police. So it was just a grassroots approach to human rights education that was changing the ways in which lives were happening. We did some filming while we were there, and some of the most passionate advocates of this were the men in the village too, who talked so inspiringly about how their eyes had been opened to different ways, and that women were their equals, and it was amazing. So yes, we have done quite a bit of work around FGM, and we're hoping to continue to do that, and in different parts of the world. On sexual violence in India, we set up a section of Amnesty 3 years ago in India. So we've not been as Amnesty in India for long, but we are having a huge resonance, which is lovely. And the issues of sexual violence are at the forefront of the work that we're doing. I think two of the biggest campaigns that we've worked on in India have been sexual violence, and trying to very differently trying to influence the Indian government in its voting at the Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka and accountability for what took place at the end of that civil war and the abuses that took place. And we engaged 2 million people in India who joined our campaign for justice for Sri Lanka. So we're hoping to build that and build a presence as Amnesty really strongly in India, and to make sure that issue about sexual violence is at the forefront of our work. On corporates, we've done various work over in different places at different times. So whether that's about Shell and the Niger Delta, or it's about other corporations, again we've worked on Vedanta and many other corporations, whether that's in corporate abuses in terms of the environment, where people are still living in areas in the Niger Delta where the land is destroyed because of the oil, the water is undrinkable, the diseases and health of people have been destroyed. or whether it is communities in India who do not want their sacred areas mined by companies like Vedanta. So we've done that kind of work. We do a lot of work trying to talk with corporates about the ways in which they should respect human rights. And at a global level, we've done work around how we think this needs to be regulated, but we're not winning that one at the moment. So we went down a route with the UN looking at how that might work. It's a difficult one, very difficult one to crack. But for the future, is that something that we should put our effort and resources into when you think about the power and the resources of corporates in the world? So that we'll continue to do those pieces of work, but whether we decide that becomes more of a focus is where we're at the moment in our thinking.
Shall I just
Yeah.
my way around?
We take just that. I think it works better with 2 or 3, doesn't it? So should we do that?
So obviously, historically, one of the roles of Amnesty International has been revealing human rights abuses that go otherwise unseen. But have you noticed a sort of qualitative difference in the age of social media and camera phones and everything between revealing and addressing human rights? And are you factoring that into your sort of strategic assessment for the following couple of years?
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, you talked a lot about influencing politicians and governments, and I'd be really interested in how you believe is the most effective way in doing this. Thank you.
Does Amnesty oppose authoritarian systems of government as an organisation? Right.
Gosh, good questions. Right. Revealing or addressing human rights abuses. Yes, I mean, in our history, we were often the movement, the people revealing those abuses, and that still sometimes happens. But you're right, and when you think about the Arab Spring and the way in which ordinary people organised and mobilised and used social media and filmed and communicated, and that is much more what is happening. So I think for us it is being alongside people, working with them, making sure that we're providing our support, that we're documenting, that we're making sure that we're doing our part of that. So during the Arab Spring we were in all of those countries, and we were trying to get into the prisons and into the morgues and into the hospitals to document. We spent quite a bit of time, I spent quite a bit of time in Tahrir Square and in some of the slums of Cairo, talking with people who had been absolutely kind of part of what was happening. It was amazing during that time, seeing that excitement and that that sense that things could change, that ordinary people could topple dictators, and it's very depressing to see what is happening at the moment. But there is also something there, I think, about when you have done that once, you have the ability to do it again, and there is all of that real vibrancy about that. So for us, it's in many ways it's less the revealing, it's more the addressing. But there are, North Korea, somewhere really difficult for us to work on. We do some of the revealing. We've used satellites to show the size of the camps that are being used and the way that they have grown. So you use technology in different ways to do what we can. Influencing governments. Our model is a very clear model of the power of ordinary people. So, 7 million members and supporters globally. Here in the UK, we're just under the 500,000 mark of members and supporters. Now, you think of what the membership of political parties is in this country. I can't remember the figures; they keep going down. So, they're in the 200,000. I'd be surprised Actually, somebody could Google membership of the Tory party, which is probably the biggest one. I think 200,000, if that. You know, there really is ability to influence through being able to have that. You know, so in the UK, we can be on the doorstep of every MP, and I mean on his doorstep, not in Westminster, on his or her doorstep, in their constituencies, in the same week, with the same demand, and those MPs will know that these people we call members, they call voters, you know, that they're there, they're in their local media, they're in they have their stalls in the streets of the local towns and cities. It is that activism. So that's massively important. And then it's about exercising political judgment, building relationships, all those other things that you do to influence anybody, but in influencing governments. So, and making sure that you're planning what it is you want to do and you're building your alliances. The Arms Trade Treaty in the UK was a great one. You know, we went about that. This is going back now to the start of my career at Amnesty. We went about that by getting the trade union movement in the UK on board. We didn't want a Labour government being told by its trade union partners that this was about jobs and not wanting to support more control, better controls on arms flows. And then we went and got the manufacturers of arms, the Defence Manufacturers Association, on board. And we got them on board because they didn't want the UK having tougher controls than other exporters of arms globally. And then we went and got the Liberal Party on board. We then went and got the Labour Party on board, and we then went and got the Conservative Party on board. And by that stage, you know, the UK was a major global player. The UK government was a major global player in getting the Arms Trade Treaty. And when Labour lost power and we had a coalition, it went into the coalition's agreement, and it started falling off their agenda. We mobilised all our members again, and it went back up the agenda. So it's one of those ones where you bring all those things, your kind of intelligence about campaigning, the way to do it, who you need, and the power of ordinary people. And do we oppose authoritarian systems of government? Well, we tend not to oppose different systems of government, but authoritarian ones are usually abusing human rights, so we probably are opposing them pretty systematically when you think about it. So for us, the key thing in any issue is what is the human rights issue. We don't support one, we're completely impartial in terms of politics, party politics and political systems and all the rest of it. There is a debate for the future about, you know, should we be supporting democracy? Should that be part of what we do? It's not at the moment. But authoritarian systems, I don't think I've ever come across an authoritarian system that isn't abusing its power against its people. So, but we'd focus on what is that, we'd have the evidence, we'd know exactly what we're talking about, and then we'd be in there. So it wouldn't be a generalisation.
This one.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, what's your take on death penalty? Thank you.
Right.
I wanted to actually asking more your stand or the Amnesty International stand toward education rights.
Thank you. Given the wide range of people who are involved in human rights defence, including involvement of faith groups in defending human rights, how do you think there's a risk on taking strong positions on controversial issues such as abortion? And how do you go about consulting your members on these sort of things?
Yeah, no, very good questions. Again, death penalty. I think the death penalty is absolutely abhorrent. I think an Amnesty's position is, in no circumstances ever would we support the death penalty. And you can argue all the cases where miscarriages of justice. You can argue all the times that it goes wrong. But we don't just argue that as Amnesty. We say that it kind of debases a society. I was on a death row in the States, in Ohio. This is some years ago now, visiting a death row inmate who we were campaigning for, and we were pretty convinced that he was innocent, but we'd be doing, it's not just about innocence for us. I was with the BBC crew, and because we were allowed to do an interview with him, and the BBC cameraman's camera wouldn't work. You just get in there and it's just all set up, and suddenly it wouldn't work. And the prison authorities were amazingly lovely, actually, and they drove him off to the local TV studio to pick up another camera. So I spent quite a bit of time with one of the guards from that particular death row. And it's a death row which had, at that stage, something like 250 people. I think they were all men on death row waiting for their executions. It was grim. It was really a soulless, grim environment. And what I was really struck by too was what it felt like it had done to that man. So he was being very pleasant, but the way he talked was just, it had such a lack of feeling about anything in it. And I just thought, I was just thinking about what being that close to the death penalty for so many years can do to people. And I've met many people who have been part of administering the system and the death penalty who say that, and countries too, where you can just, can you imagine getting up each morning and turning on the Today programme, which I do, and most days there being a countdown to an execution. That's what it's like in some states, that you live with it, and then it's botched, and then it's an innocent person, and then it just is something that we oppose. Education rights, increasingly Amnesty, we're looking at economic, social and cultural rights, and that's an area that we have moved into. It's part of the legacy of the kind of Cold War, that people worked on civil and political rights, or economic, social and cultural, and we need to bring those together. And we've done work, we've done some work on education rights, obviously in areas of kind of gross discrimination, girls in Afghanistan I mentioned, but we haven't done masses of work. So those are, as we look to the future, talking with our colleagues from the Global South as well as the North about where our efforts should go. It's going to be really interesting to hear from them where they see that going in the future. And how do we make decisions about abortion? We were talking about this just before I came into the room, because we are a democracy as Amnesty, so the decision about abortion, about should Amnesty have a position on abortion, was a decision that our members took globally, and we have what I think of as our global parliament, which meets every 2 years, and every section of Amnesty sends its delegation. Those delegations are consulted back home in all sorts of ways, and we come together, and those big direction or policy issues get debated, really, really strongly debated, and decisions get made. And mostly those decisions get made through consensus, but not always. And so we had no position on abortion, and you could have all sorts of positions on abortion. At the end of a huge debate where Amnesty came to its conclusions, were that we would take a position that women should have the right to make decisions for themselves about abortion if their health was under threat and their lives were at risk, or if the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest. So a very narrow definition, which is where our policy rests at the moment. We haven't taken it more broadly than that. That did get us into difficulties with some faiths in different faiths in different parts of the world. And some parts of Amnesty weren't terribly happy about that decision, which was made about 8 years ago, I think. But in the last 8 years, I think that the whole Amnesty movement is on board with it. So in some areas of the world, you would think that it would be something that would be very difficult for Amnesty members, and it was 8 years ago. It's not now. So in Ireland, in our sexual and reproductive rights work, in Ireland, we have taken up the case of the young woman who was refused treatment as she was in the early stages of her pregnancy, and she died. And so we're taking up these issues and getting support. So these are debates that move. Nobody is static on these things, really. But at the end of the day, the decision is made through a democratic process. We try to bring everybody with us, but at the end of the day, if we need to have a vote, we'll have a vote.
I'll move further up. Okay, let's take these three.
I have one specific question for some of the religious people or certain people. They are radically in their religious belief or their culture, so they're ignorant about their own human rights issues, and they refuse to learn or to approach Western notion of democracy and justice. So I wonder, how do Amnesty International approach these people to change the human rights issue of theirs and to break this kind of recognition barriers?
Hi, I wanted to know, if you have secret talks and secret negotiations from time to time with the officials before going for a broad campaign, like ICRC is doing in terms of war crimes. Is it something that you are used to, and have you seen if it was producing better outcomes in specific cases, or do you always start by a campaign before engaging with talks with the authorities?
I think you raised an important point about the lack of Western intervention in cases which aren't seen by the general population of, say, the UK, migrants coming over from Africa, or if you look at Ebola recently, it's only really been focused on the white Western people who have gained Ebola. How do you change, I guess, the media's views and the population in the West's views to combat these issues?
Okay. How do we challenge people who say that their religious faith allows them to do these things? I think in all sorts of different ways. Fundamentally, I think through our human rights education work. So I described some of it in Sierra Leone, and it will be different in different places in the world. But I think that it's a fundamental of what we do practically everywhere. That we introduce human rights education, whether we're talking to children in schools, to villagers, to prison guards, to police, to religious faiths, to others. So our human rights education program is a way of breaking that down and also of strengthening activists to be able to have those discussions too. Do we have secret talks before we decide upon a campaign? I doubt if we have secret talks, really. We have talks. We'll sound people out. We'll gather as much intelligence as we can about what it is we're thinking of doing and where we think the different targets that we're working to might be in their thinking. I wouldn't think that some of that might be private rather than secret. Secret sounds like we're kind of concocting something with people, but we'd just gather as much intelligence and thought as we could from as many people as we can. We do get, as you would imagine, we do get information from people in all sorts of situations which, where we protect their identity. So Boko Haram, for example, the kidnap of those 200 plus girls 6 months ago, we know that the Nigerian authorities knew several hours before the kidnap at that school that a Boko Haram gang were on their way to that named school. And we know that they knew that with enough time that the local garrison, which was close enough to that school, the military in that place could have been transferred to the school to stop it. We know that because people in the Nigerian military have told us that. And we have it from several sources. And obviously we'll protect those sources. We wouldn't expose those people. And we checked it from different, from local people who made phone calls, who said what was happening and what was about to happen. So we do get, as you would imagine, lots of information in that way. How do we raise some of these issues, migrants, Ebola, in the media, particularly in the West? We have quite big media operation. We do get a lot of coverage. Our difficulty and our challenge is to get beyond the obvious places, so beyond the broadsheets and beyond the usual media that will take these things up, to try to get to more popular media, to reach people in a broader way. So one of the things that we in Amnesty in the UK do every so often is, you may have heard of the Secret Policeman's Ball, which is to be able to reach out to whole audiences that kind of heard of Amnesty International but don't really know what we do. So to try to bring more people to us, and we try in different ways to do that, to reach out to as many people as possible, use media and advertising and other ways to do that. And it's quite tough, it's a crowded market, cutting through, being able to get to people who may not be immediately interested in some of the things that we do is tough. The other thing that we do here in the UK is the human rights education work that we do. So as Amnesty, we've populated the national curriculum in terms of the human rights component of the citizenship element. So we're helping teachers with the way in which they can do that, giving them materials, kind of populating that part of the curriculum. And we have youth groups in about 20% of schools at the moment, and we're going to expand that, and we are in most universities with student groups. So that idea of talking to people in an educational environment too about human rights, it becomes part of what you think about in terms of your own being, because it's not just about everybody joining Amnesty and becoming activists. It's about internalizing it yourself, isn't it? That kind of, if you think about human rights and you think about how you are with other people, and the way that it changes yourself to be thinking about other people's rights as well as your own, it kind of changes things. It influences you, as a person, how you are in the world, and so that's what we're trying to do. Obviously, I'd love everybody to join Amnesty too, but that's not quite going to happen. But that sense that we will have had that influence about the ways in which people think and want to live their lives. So it's all sorts of different ways, but we're always looking for other ways and other ideas.
Kate, are you happy to take one more round?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay. So if we go here, here, and here.
Thank you. I was just wondering, as the director of Amnesty in the UK, what your stance would be on Britain sending military, having a military role in combating ISIS?
Hi. I read an interesting essay by Albert Einstein recently where he compared conscription to slavery, and I was just wondering if conscription had ever come up amongst Amnesty.
Hello. You mentioned a number of times about Amnesty being democratic and about the membership. And I was wondering whether the membership of Amnesty is concentrated in certain areas of the world. Like you mentioned that there's 500,000 in the UK, and whether that has an effect on the decisions you make. And if so, is that fair that certain areas of the world are affecting how you carry out your work across the world?
Right. Military role in terms of ISIS, we hardly ever say anything about military intervention or not. You know, it would mean us having to kind of, we don't have the expertise to make those judgments about military intervention or not. And in very, very limited circumstances with real strict criteria, we might just say something. But it would take us into so many areas of controversy that it would be very, very difficult for a global movement to hold together in those situations. What we do is we talk really absolutely specifically about the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, the protection of civilians, the transfer of arms, the protection of refugees, you know, all of those things that go with military intervention. So we wouldn't be saying whether bombing ISIS is the right thing to do or not. We would be talking about some of the arms transfers that are going on at the moment, and whether the countries transferring those arms are absolutely certain where they're going and what they will be used for. We'll be talking about the refugees, and we'll be talking about the Geneva Conventions and the protection of civilians. What was that second one? I can't read my own. Oh, right, conscientious objectors, right. Comparing that to slavery. No, we wouldn't compare it to slavery. It is in some parts of the Amnesty movement, it is controversial. We would basically say, in terms of conscription, that you do need to have conscience. You do need to allow conscience to operate. So where there are conscientious objectors, there need to be ways that that is respected. So if a country has conscription, it also should address and fairly address the issue of conscientious objectors. And then the democracy issue in terms of Amnesty, you're absolutely right, which is why we're completely engaged at the moment on building our movement in the Global South. So we have been far too Northern Hemisphere, and we are now adjusting that. So we've moved our resources, many of our resources. We've put real planning and work into building our presence in India, in Brazil. We're doing that in Nigeria now. We're building some of our smaller sections, and we've moved our resources from being a research hub in London to that being locally based. So in Africa, Asia, Latin America, moving our resources to be closer to where the abuses are taking place. So we will start to change. So, you know, mobilizing 2 million people in India will significantly change what Amnesty looks like. When we come to that voting as a movement, it's not, you know, 500,000 from the UK and 1,000 from Sierra Leone. It's the voting is weighted. So the biggest section of Amnesty has 6 votes, and the smallest section of Amnesty has 1 vote. But we also work hugely on trying to get consensus. Votes are very, very rare. We absolutely listen to each other and try to find the way through an issue. And it can have its downsides in that we are a tanker, you know, so changing direction is kind of quite slow because we want to carry everybody with us. But when you are a membership organisation, that's what you do. And my best example of that was really before my time at Amnesty, but Amnesty had big discussions about LGBT issues. We were probably a bit late to the recognition of the human rights aspects. And partly that was a movement kind of coming from many different cultures, kind of working their way through what this all meant. And some of the sections of Amnesty that needed the most persuading are now absolutely at the forefront of our campaigning on LGBT rights. So that's the win. You know, you may not be the first to an issue, but when you get there, you bring the whole movement with you. So there are consequences. You know, who is it who said the only system worse than democracy? What was it? I can't remember that phrase. But you know, that tell me a better way of doing it. I mean, it does have its problems, but it also has these massive benefits too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such an inspiring talk, and thank you all for coming. Please join us for a drink next door.